tidbits that you're learning and sharing on Twitter for your colleagues that weren't able to be here today. And just please consider tagging at OHAAP. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our presenters for this afternoon. Dr. Aparna Bol, the medical director of the program, and Dr. Nicholas Newman, the environmental health consultant for the project, will also be presenting on this topic. So I will turn it over to our experts.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be talking a bit about lead poisoning prevention today. I'm Dr. Nick Newman. I just wanted to bring your attention to a QI project that the Ohio AP is sponsoring, and this training material was developed as part of that project. And there's still room for a couple more practices if interested. The idea is to help practices better respond to children who are living in high-risk zip codes, both getting their lead test done and following up on it. And we'll have there's coaching. We have some nice handouts and resources online. And we kicked off in July, but there's still some spaces available if anyone's interested. Next slide. So the webinar, we'll take a small break in the middle because it's kind of a long time to be sitting in front of Zoom. And but overall, what we're going to do is look at and review the epidemiology of lead exposure in children, recognize the short and long-term implications of that lead exposure, and then understand anticipatory guidance and medical management recommendations for those children. Next slide. So yeah, it's just broken up into two parts here. So we're going to start now. And I just want to bring up, certainly this COVID-19 has caused some somewhat unprecedented changes in practice and follow-up. And the Ohio Department of Health has noted a dramatic decrease in the number of children getting tested for lead, and that's probably a function of a dramatic decrease in the children coming in for primary care. And at the same time, a lot of discussion has talked about economic and racial, and especially racial disparities in this country and how that may be impacting children. And it's important for children to receive their care in a medical home where the follow-up and the advice can be best given. Next slide. So as my training as an environmental health doctor as well as in pediatrics kind of introduced me to this idea of the epidemiological triad. And so basically to have disease, three things, at least three things interact. There are host factors, there are factors about the agent itself, and then there are environmental factors that play into that. Next slide. And this traditionally was seen in infectious disease. Cholera, people who are younger or older, or they're already somewhat dehydrated, might have worse disease than someone else who is more better shape to start. But the environment is that it comes from a contaminated water source, and you need to have the agent in that water source contaminated in order to create disease. And if you disturb any of those three things, you can change the course of a disease. Next slide. And although we don't think of lead poisoning necessarily as infectious, the same rubric can be applied. So there are host factors, age, nutrition, behaviors. We'll talk about some of that. If the child's environment is, let's say you have lead paint in your house, but the paint is all in good shape, then your child's environment is actually beneficial in terms of preventing that exposure and developing the disease in the long term. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what is lead? So we're going to focus on different parts of this triad. So what is lead? So lead is a malleable, corrosion-resistant metal. And it's been used by humans for thousands and thousands of years. And in fact, the toxicity was described, at least in the West, Western literature, by the ancient Greek physicians thousands of years ago. And it's thought of as like the first pollutant, it's like the first thing that we've like dug out of the ground, created, and then it kind of got everywhere. And we've created a whole bunch of other pollutants since then, unfortunately, but like this is kind of the ancestor of all of them. And acute toxic exposures have been known all through history. I mean, the Greeks and Romans had rules about where metallurgists could work in a city, et cetera. Like this has been well known for a long time. Next slide, please. And you can see, like over time, from the time that we discovered how to separate metals, thousands of years ago, to the exhaustion of the Roman silver mines. I mean, like this is. I bring the historical perspective in because I think we don't always realize like a problem like this has actually been going on a lot longer than we would have thought. And often lead is a byproduct of the production of other things. And so humans being humans, we're like, well, how can we put that to work? And so obviously the Romans used it quite famously in lining the aqueducts and delivering water for the baths, et cetera. But we are now at like levels of production that haven't been seen ever in human history. Next slide, please. And to put a perspective on it, if you could just click once, that should give us a little arrow. Yeah. So, we talk about, oh, well, things are so much better than they were in the 60s or whatever. So, yes, they are. But if you look, in the middle, you have like the typical American from the late 20th century, early 21st century. And each dot represents 40 micrograms of lead, like in total in their body. And on the right is overt lead poisoning, which is definitely a lot more dots, right? But ancient peoples, like 10,000 years ago, the amount of lead that humans were exposed to, like through our much longer history, was really, really small. And so, but I guess what I'm trying to stress is that you hear a lot about like no amount is okay, and we say, oh, it's so much lower than it used to be, but used to be is not even a blink of an eye. That we're talking about when the average lead levels were extremely high back in the 60s and 70s. But historically, lead exposure in humans has been pretty low. Next slide, please. So basically, it's increased a lot over time. So where to find it? Next slide. So common sources of lead, and I would say like almost like 80% of the kids in Ohio are exposed to deteriorating lead-based paint, mostly in housing. But there's also a significant contribution to lead exposure in children from parental take-home exposure, water, particularly where there's issues with it not being appropriately tested and remediated. Food and herbs, so imported items typically, soil, particularly urban soils. People will grow in a garden that happens to be lead contaminated and not know it. Toys, typically we blame, quote, imported toys, but like if there are lots and lots of toys that end up with lead. I get the recall notices, and they come pretty frequently. And in my clinic, I see kids exposed to lead from toys pretty commonly. Cosmetics and ceremonial powders. So like these may be items like surma or other items that are used for like coloring on the face or for religious ceremonies, which when they originally created, like many years ago, didn't have lead in them, but it turns out lead is just cheaper to make. Like I said, spices and some traditional medicines can contain lead. Next slide. And yeah, unfortunately, when this got transferred over, it was a white, the X and Y axis were white. So just to illustrate, where you have on the 1974, if you look up up that Y axis, the average lead level for children like under 6 at that time was about 15 or 16. And removing lead from gasoline did a huge service in terms of reducing the lead burden in the population. And typically now, we see more pockets of lead exposure, although some of those pockets are quite large, to be completely honest. And so I also bring this out to just say that, the addressing lead in gasoline has been a really public health triumph. Next slide, please. So there's a number of occupations that are particularly high risk. Probably the biggest area that I see are parents who work in construction, as well as certain lead, metal recycling, welding. Police and military personnel, basically, they get exposed to lead when they're doing their training on firing ranges. And then people, artists, work with pottery. Auto repair is also a big issue, because even though we phased out leaded gasoline, there's a large amount of lead that stays in the soil around roadways, and that recontaminates them. In addition, lead is still used in bridge paint and some other markings on roadways. Next slide, please. So if you were to look at what the relative contribution of different sources of lead are for children, basically, next slide will bring up the, just click. Anyway, can you go back, please, Alex? Yeah, so basically water and dust are the biggest contributors to children's lead. Next slide, please. And lead in drinking water. So this comes up in the kind of post-Flint, Michigan era. Comes up as a question an awful lot. The federal government banned the use of lead service lines in 1986, but other jurisdictions had banned them earlier. For instance, Cincinnati had banned lead service lines in 1926. And I use this map as an example of where lead might be. So if you look at the map, you see all these little green and yellow squares, and they basically indicate green meaning no lead, yellow lead. And what you can see is there'll be a street where all the houses have it except for one, or you have neighbors where oh, theirs has been cleared, this one is not. And so it's what makes the problem a little bit difficult to figure out is that it's so heterogeneous. Even though the housing may be the same age, work over time may have some of those lines may have been replaced. So interestingly enough, they were still allowed to use lead in plumbing fixtures indoors up until 2014. So those fancy faucets, that they and fixtures that have these bends and other stuff in them. You can tell I'm a pediatrician, not a plumber, right? They were allowed to use lead because that made them more malleable, and you make these cool designs. Right now, the action level, and this is really more on the perspective from the functioning of the water system, is set to 15 parts per billion. That's a little bit complicated to explain here, and I'm happy to offline explain to people how that testing works. But basically, the current testing that's done is not based on actual use scenarios. Next slide, please. So if you look at housing in Ohio, 2/3 of the housing was built during the lead paint era. So basically, that was anything built before 1978. And we kind of break it into two parts here because between 1950 and 1978, it started to phase out lead-based paint. So houses, in reality, the highest risk is probably houses built before 1960. But the way the census broke up the data, it was a little hard to show it that way. But it illustrates the point that like the vast majority of the housing in Ohio is potentially at risk. Next slide, please. So how did so many homes get painted with lead paint? I mean, like really, like if the ancient Greeks knew that lead was poisonous and like it's been known all through history, like, so how did that happen, right? So next slide. So if you look at the history of lead paint, basically like lead poisoning as a thing, you know, in the US was officially recognized by the government, the US government in the late 19th century. And in the very early 20th century, a ophthalmologist from New South Wales, Australia, described how eating deteriorating porch paint led to acute lead poisoning and death in a number of children. And then the European countries started banning lead paint. Eventually, the company that was making all this lead paint admitted it was a poison in the 1920s. And it was further recognized in the 40s that it was responsible for a huge number of long-term problems in children. And ultimately, lead-based paint was banned in the United States. Next slide. Now, what happened was between the point of the Europeans starting to ban lead paint, like through the League of Nations, the paint manufacturers in the US started marketing lead paint to parents and children actually using a paint book. And this was kind of a classic, I don't know, from in terms of advertising, but you know, the same group of people who were originally marketing lead paint to children went on to market cigarettes as well, and a few other things that we've later found out to be detrimental to our health. So I would beg you to wonder, like some of the other things that are being marketed to us now, what of those things are good or bad for us. Next slide. So I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Bull.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Newman. Before moving on, I just want to address a question that came up in the chat box. If it's possible to expound on the food, herbs, and spices thought to be high in lead, I can address that. And Dr. Newman, if you want to chime in to add, that's fine. There are some spices in particular that we see that I've seen with kids in my region that are used in some immigrant communities in particular. One that's frequently implicated is turmeric, especially turmeric that's bought in open air markets abroad. Typically turmeric that's bought and sold here is less of a risk, but certainly I've seen families using turmeric sold in that way that has been adulterated with lead. Some of the traditional cosmetics and ceremonial items. Dr. Newman mentioned, I think, one or two, a couple others that are frequently seen, or not infrequently at least. One is vermilion powder, which is also called sindoor powder, that is used in South Asian cultures on the forehead usually, and if ingested, that also can be adulterated with lead. We've seen several cases of that actually in Cuyahoga County in the recent past. And then also kajal, which goes by many names. It's called kajal in South Asian cultures, but is actually used all over the world. It's kind of an eyeliner that can either be used on the eyes, sometimes is used in sort of ceremonial practices on the face of children. And that is a cosmetic that also I've seen adulterated with lead that kids will then ingest and be exposed that way. I don't know if there's anything else, Dr. Newman, you wanted to add either in the chat box or otherwise to that question. So to kind of continue where we left off on the subject of housing, you know, while we talk a lot about housing age, housing maintenance is really important too. So lead-based paint that's adhered to the wall or to the porch and isn't peeling or chipping is not as big of a risk as a house like the one on the left here, where there's overtly peeling and chipping paint. And I think sometimes this issue is sort of framed often unconsciously as one where, you know, maybe the homeowner or the parent isn't keeping house well enough. It's not clean enough. It's not well maintained enough. There's sort of this element of it's that individual who isn't keeping up with housework or something of that nature. And I think it's really important that we are intentional in understanding that really there's a systemic there are systemic forces at work here, that there are neighborhood level issues around systemic disinvestment that render certain neighborhoods and communities more likely to be affected by unsafe housing and by lead exposure. Next slide, please. Thank you. As many of us know, the concept of environmental injustice describes how environmental health hazards do not affect all populations equally, and that vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted. Children themselves are a vulnerable population, and I'll get into sort of the unique vulnerabilities of children to lead exposure in just a moment, but also historically marginalized and discriminated against communities are disproportionately affected. And in the United States, race is the best predictor of proximity to environmental health hazards. Lead is no exception. And as you can see, non-Hispanic Black children have almost 3 times higher risk of elevated blood lead levels compared to other populations. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch on an example of a systemic issue that has that continues to cause these health disparities or contribute to these disparities in environmental exposures, including lead. The map on the right is a picture of redlined Cleveland, and as some of you know, redlining describes a practice of delineating neighborhoods that are considered high risk for housing investment, and it kind of comes from New Deal era policies in which maps were color coded by the federal government, with red indicating that the neighborhood was, quote, high risk for investment for mortgage insurance, and the original Federal Housing Administration charter included also some really explicit language about physical barriers and really policing practices to ensure racial segregation in neighborhoods. In many of these neighborhoods, systemic disinvestment continues, so sort of the legacy of redlining lives on. And certainly that's the case in Cleveland, where largely Black neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland were redlined by law and continue to be the neighborhoods with highest risk of unsafe housing and lead exposure. There's also a growing amount of evidence sort of drawing connections between redlining and a whole host of other persistent health disparities, including infant mortality, extreme heat impacts, and so on. And lead is an example of that. So I just think it's important that we as advocates and as we message the importance of primary prevention around lead exposure, we just understand that there are systemic forces at work that render certain communities at higher risk. Next slide, please. So Dr. Newman talked about this triad, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the host, children primarily under 6, but we'll talk about children and their relative risks. Next slide, please. Kids are uniquely vulnerable to all kinds of environmental health hazards for a lot of reasons, because of their stages of development and their unique physiology. When it comes to lead exposure, young infants and toddlers have a more limited diet than older adults and older children and adults. So nutritional insufficiency can be a risk factor for lead exposure or lead absorption. Also, of course, toddlers and young infants are on the floor. They tend to eat things off of the floor. They put things in their mouth as they explore their world that is not food, like this child is doing in this picture. Next slide, please. So as young children are exploring their world and they're putting objects and toys and paint chips and soil in their mouth, they're at higher risk for lead exposure. Older children, if they have persistent hand-to-mouth behaviors, if they're developmentally delayed or have pica, they may also be at risk. Next slide, please. Children also have a unique physiology in that their GI absorption of lead is higher at younger ages. That absorption decreases with age. Iron deficiency increases the risk of lead absorption. And you can see this chart that sort of illustrates that. The fact that risk decreases as kids get older. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about the acute and chronic impacts of lead exposure in children. Next slide, please. Fortunately, acute symptomatic lead poisoning in the US is rare and getting more uncommon. We're going to talk a little bit about what the reference level means and the fact that the reference level is 5 and it was lowered not too long ago to 5 micrograms per deciliter. There can be some technical concerns. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. It's important to note that this is a public health action level. It's not sort of a diagnostic or prognostic level because there really is no safe level of lead. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. As I said, acute lead poisoning is growing more uncommon. It's rare, but altered mental status, abdominal pain, headaches, and at extremely high level seizures can be observed. Can advance, please. Next slide. Chronic toxicity, though, is something that we see at even quote unquote low levels of lead. At a population level, this continues to be incredibly impactful in Ohio and around the country. The primary target of lead is the developing brain. We know that children exposed to lead experience decrements in cognition, decrease in their IQ, is associated with behavioral and learning problems, ADHD. And as I said before, there's no safe level of lead. So there's no threshold below which, except 0, that is safe. So there's no threshold at which, this is where this impact starts. In fact, at even quote unquote low levels of lead, the developing brain is still affected. These effects are not reversible, and iron deficiency not only increases the risk of lead absorption, it also worsens the effect of lead. As we know, iron insufficiency also creates additional risk for neurodevelopmental issues. And it's worth noting that the relationship between lead exposure and decrements in IQ is not linear. So if you advance to the next slide. Relatively speaking, the greatest impact on number of IQ points lost at a population level to lead exposure is highest at those lowest levels. So you can see that the line is not straight, it's more of a curve. So it is true that increasing blood lead levels continues to have an impact on declining IQ, but relatively speaking, the largest relative impact is actually at those lowest levels. Next slide, please. Of course, lead is rarely the only risk factor for children in terms of school performance, cognition, learning, and behavior, but we know it is an independent risk factor for problems with school performance, cognition, learning, and behavior. So this illustrates one example of a study that demonstrates this, which is that here there's an increased risk of school failure with increasing blood lead levels. And that if you advance, if you go back one more, just pointing out that children with blood lead level of 10 micrograms per deciliter have an increased 45% risk of failing standardized tests. This is over looking at children in Detroit public schools. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, behavioral problems are associated with lead exposure. There are estimates that about 25% of ADHD may be attributable to lead exposure. Even quote unquote low blood levels are associated with ADHD. And again, that lead exposure adds to other risk factors in many of these patients. Antisocial behavior, increased interaction with the criminal justice system and criminal behavior. And these impacts are not immediate. They can be delayed and they can be seen over the course of a lifetime. Next slide, please. When we think about the long range impacts of lead's neurodevelopmental toxicity, so for example, children who have elevated blood lead levels are 7 times more likely to drop out of high school than children who do not have elevated blood lead levels. And we know that high school graduates have significantly higher earning potential over a lifetime. So we think about lifelong and even generational impacts of lead exposure, and they are significant. Next slide, please. Lead is an important risk factor for criminal behavior and interaction with the criminal justice system, in addition to some of the other risks listed here. Next slide, please. And that's why when you think about the purely economic impact of lead exposure, it's so enormous. If we look at across sectors, there are costs in the medical system, in the educational system with educational accommodations, incarceration and criminal justice related costs, and then the lifelong and even generational impacts of lost IQ and productivity. The return on investment for lead poisoning prevention is really enormous. And the range is large because it sort of depends on how wide you cast your net in looking at these impacts. The longer the timeline and the greater the cross-sector impacts that are included, the larger the ROI is. And really the only thing that's even comparable is the ROI on childhood vaccines. So this, as we think about environmental justice, the fact that this remains several generations later, something that our children remain exposed to, and that we have now parents who were lead poisoned and kids who are lead poisoned in the same communities. It's really an enormous environmental justice issue. Huge ROI. We know what it takes to prevent lead exposure. We know that safe housing is incredibly important for lead poisoning prevention, and we really have not mustered the political will to make this happen. So next slide, please. This making the point that, sorry, if you go back, that was animated, making the point that the return on investment for vaccines is comparable to sort of even the lower end of the range for lead poisoning prevention's ROI. Next slide, please. So we mentioned highest risk groups are young children, especially younger than 6 years old. Coming from a low-income community is a risk factor because of that issue of housing and neighborhood infrastructure. African-American and Hispanic populations are at higher risk. Recent immigrants and especially refugees are at high risk. This slide is also making the point that, that looking at elderly populations, that childhood lead exposure continues to have a lifelong impact, that there's an increase in all-cause mortality when you look at older adults who have a history of lead exposure. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we focused on school performance, decreased IQ, behavioral problems, delinquency, incarceration. It's also true that that pregnant women who are exposed to lead, there's a risk for preterm birth, and that data comes primarily from international studies. But truly, over the entire life course, lead exposure carries risk, and that risk lasts throughout the lifetime. Next slide, please. I think I turn it over to Nick here.
All right, okay. Thing working again. So I just want to address one of the questions that came up in the box about other metals associated with ADHD. So I'll say that lead is probably, because it's the first toxicant, it's been the best studied of all of them. But some of the work that we've done down in Cincinnati, we've looked at manganese, and we have some concerns about excess manganese exposure and child neurodevelopment. So that definitely, could be on our list. Cadmium, there's a group in New York that's been looking at that. That appears also to be, may have some implications with behavior as well. I think one of the things that's, and we didn't have time in this talk, one of the things that's often hard to disentangle is early life versus continuous versus like concurrent exposure to these different metals and how they may affect the brain. So that's one of the limitations. I would say though that lead has been by far the best studied, and so is best understood. And the other thing I would bring up and emphasize is that low iron, and what these all have in common, like they're all like +2 metals, right? Like, so at some point. So, these are all very important in terms of brain physiology. And so when there's an imbalance of any of them, that is a potential problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the pathophysiology. So we think, basically lead follows calcium around the body. And so it gets to like calcium receptors or pumps. And the problem is that it can change its valence state while it's in the body. So calcium stays +2 pretty much all the time, right? But lead can go to +4, it can go to 0. And so that causes, a release of other, what they call free radicals, that can go and damage the surrounding cells and tissues. And we think that lead, because of how that's working, is interfering with how the dendritic connections are made in the brain. And so that's why this early life exposure is so important, because that's where a lot of those dendritic connections are being made and where the pruning is taking place. And in addition, it interferes with heme synthesis and is directly toxic to mitochondria. And now, the slide that showed that there seemed to be a bigger decrease in IQ and a bigger decrease in like math scores at lower lead levels is hard. I think at its surface, people are like, what are you talking about? But when you look at some of the data from like animal models and other experimental models, we know that very, very tiny levels of lead, like picomolar levels of lead, are equivalent to micromolar concentrations of calcium. So they may be triggering off the activation of certain enzymes that at these very, very low levels. And that may be part of the mechanism, but it's, to be honest, even after all these years, it's still not completely understood. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to bring in here was, this is how might lead be actually working on the brain. And so this is basically an adult brain, but this is basically a composite of a whole bunch of different brains of adults that were enrolled in a lead study from when they were infants. So they've been followed from infancy through about age 40. And so we've been able to learn a huge amount by observing like what happens to these folks over time. And we know what their level of exposure was to lead and other things at early points in their life. And what we've noticed is that in the parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, some of the association areas, and the cerebellum, there are differences in the size of the structures of the brain when you compare it to kind of the typical brain. And I'm an old like Mel Brooks fan, so like you have like they go looking for brains, and find the abnormal brain. So what we're trying to do is create a normal brain, and then look to see if the lead exposed people have an abnormal brain, right? So I think this is important because it brings across the idea that it isn't just, that there is a biological basis to how lead is operating. Next slide, please. So what about lead screening, lead testing? So, and this is what we do in our offices, right? So I would think of it more as surveillance or case finding, because we're trying to find the kids who are exposed, right? We've talked about like there's no safe level, right? So that's not an ideal screening test. The screening test would be you found someone in a pre-disease level state and you're able to do something about it. Since we can't like completely reverse it, the exposure, so we're trying to find kids for whom primary prevention has failed them. And I think this is an important activity in as far that we also know from studies that yes, the level of your lead is important as a child, but it's also very important how long that level stays high. It's not just a point on the graph, it's the area under the curve. And so if we can shrink the area under the curve, we're likely to have better outcomes. Next slide, please. So like I said, we're trying to identify cases for which primary prevention has failed. And in terms of that, we want to be able to get people connected with treatment, if treatment is necessary, and environmental intervention. But most interventions are public health interventions. And basically, like I was implying, the goal is to reduce the blood lead levels as rapidly as possible. So in terms of screening questions, these are often promulgated, like live in an older house, live in a house before 1978, other children in the household with lead exposure, an adult with a lead-based hobby or job, any home remedies with lead. For the most part, there's a good number of people who may not know the answer to these questions. Can you please just click once? And so this doesn't explain that much in terms of the variance in blood lead levels. Next slide, please. And they did a review of these questionnaires several years ago and basically found that they did not perform much better than chance at predicting a lead exposure in children. Next slide. Just click once. And the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has actually gone as far as to say that questionnaires are not useful. Please click ahead. Right. So really, the take-home point is that you should follow the Ohio Department of Health or local public health guidance on testing. So who should be tested for lead? So the state law requires that children who are covered by Medicaid insurance be tested at 1 and 2 years, approximately 1 and 2 years of age. And then additionally, children who live in high-risk zip codes are also supposed to be checked. Additional jurisdictions may recommend children being checked between 3 to 6 years of age. Our Cincinnati Health Department recommends that. Children living in pre-1950 housing or clinical suspicion of lead exposure. So like if you have a child, like I have a number of kids, actually dozens of them, that a pediatrician in the community was concerned that they might be exposed to lead because they were consuming a lot of imported spices. And it turned out that they were right, even though they might not live in a high-risk zip code and may not be covered by Medicaid. So like the purpose of guidelines are just like, as I see, are like the bumpers in the bowling alley. Like they're just to keep the ball like on the bowling alley. But we can use our clinical judgment and decide who needs to be tested. Next slide, please. So, but once again, zip codes are not perfect either. So basically, just to reiterate, children with Medicaid must be tested, and then any child who has not been tested previously before 36 to 72 months must have like at least one test during that time if they're covered by Medicaid. Next slide, please. So there's basically two ways to do this, right? Like you could either do a capillary sample or a venous sample, and each one has its benefits and downsides. So like the capillary is a little easier to get, but it may not be as specific for actual like whether there's a high blood lead level or not. But if the capillary is high and the venous is undetectable, that's actually an opportunity for primary prevention. So like I would not throw one out or the other. And the truth is, it's like most practices, it's much easier to get a capillary sample than a venous sample. I happen to work at a big children's hospital, and so I have the luxury of having staff who can do that, but that's not always the case. Next slide, please. So anyone who does the testing in their office is aware of this, but all blood lead tests on Ohio residents, whether child or adult, must be reported to the Ohio Department of Health. And then this is stored in the HELP system, they call it, the Healthy Housing and Lead Poisoning Surveillance System. And they then update that on the public information warehouse every week as they've verified that. Next slide, please. And then just to give you an idea of like where the high-risk zip codes are, it might be easier to say where the high-risk zip codes aren't. They're basically in kind of the exurban counties and zip codes where you see this yellow color. That's considered the low-risk area, and all the others are considered high risk. And some of them, because they're so densely bunched together in the cities, you can't even make them out. But essentially, probably about 90% of the zip codes in the state are considered high risk. Next slide, please. So from what I understand, we have a poll that will come up. Oh, there you go, in Zoom, just to get some feedback from all of you. And then when we finish these handful of questions, I'm looking here, I think it's 4 questions, then we'll have a short break. There we go. All right. So we were going to just take like a 5-minute break so that everyone can get up and walk around, whatever you need to do, stand up. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Did you want to go through the polling questions first, though, Nick, or you wanted to?
They all kind of disappeared on me, so
I see the next one. So the answer to the first one, it looks like folks said that, I don't know if you saw the distribution of responses.
Yeah,
okay, there were some who said very confident in providing information about testing and follow-up. The majority said somewhat confident. And then I now see the second question. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I thought—
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, let's do that. So how often do you provide and discuss lead resources with families for children with elevated blood lead levels? Rarely is the most common response to this one. Let's go to the next one. What are current challenges in your practice surrounding lead testing and follow-up? I think you can click as many as apply. And there's a lot here, so let's give everybody a second to look at them. Yeah, there's a question, can we have a little bit longer? I feel like they're vanishing very quickly too. I don't know if, Alex, there's a way to let this one linger for a minute. Okay, okay. So to this one, lack of awareness of guidelines was cited by the majority of folks who answered. Awareness or familiarity with guidelines. Medicaid requirements, being in a low risk area, lack of on-site blood testing were some other common responses to this one. Yeah, apologies. I'm not familiar with Zoom polling technology, so Alex, thank you for helping here. I think we have one more. What are current strengths in your practice surrounding lead testing and follow-up? So again, click as many as apply, and we'll give you a minute to do that. And I think this is the last question. It looks like people feel like they're having on-site blood testing and trained staff is helpful in about a third of the respondents, feeling comfortable with the guidelines and having a systematic approach to testing those on Medicaid or living in a high-risk zip code. All right, thank you guys for responding to the poll questions. Let's take about, 5 minutes to stretch, and at 2:15 we'll continue. Okay, I hope everyone had a chance to take a quick stretching break. I would like to bring us back together. And Dr. Newman, if you are back, I'm actually going to turn it over to you for a moment to comment a little bit further on the question related to mercury exposure.
Yeah, hi. So I was looking at some of the stuff in the chat over the break. So one of the things I want to maybe clarify when I said about some of the other metals. So like one of the things that's really complicated about these exposures is that when the exposure happens may lead to different outcomes later in life. So like this ideas of windows of vulnerability. And from what we understand, I kind of lumped some things together that maybe I shouldn't have. So like the evidence that we have suggests that postnatal lead exposure is associated with ADHD, as well as perhaps manganese. And then prenatal cadmium exposure may be associated with ADHD, and prenatal mercury exposure. And part of that has to do with how each of these chemicals works. And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but basically, like if lead is something that interferes with calcium and therefore it interferes with the dendritic pruning, mercury tends to interfere with microtubule formation and therefore DNA replication. And so the prenatal period is more sensitive to that because of the rapidly replicating cells. And so that's why you can have like different effects at different times. So I had tried not to get into the weeds with that a little bit, but I feel like we ought to try to like just to clarify like both what I said and what I was seeing in the chat box. So hopefully that addressed some of what was going on there. Thanks,
Yep.
Dr. Ball, you can
Yep.
take over.
Thank you. And I guess I'll just add one quick point. I know it's a little bit off topic, but since there was so much conversation about mercury, with the prenatal exposure to methylmercury being something that is an important public health issue, I want to point out that AAP is involved with challenging a rollback to the mercury air toxic standards that the EPA has proposed. So something that's relevant, especially to us here in Ohio, since methylmercury exposure is an issue in our region. So to turn back to our presentation, the second half here, we're really going to focus on screening, testing, and treatment. So next slide, please. It's important to point out that we clinicians and public health professionals work in concert and in a complementary fashion here. We clinicians have a role in primary prevention, as there is a role for public health. Our job is to make sure we're adhering to testing guidelines, reporting testing results, and then adhering to medical management guidelines around follow-up for kids with elevated blood lead levels. And then there's a important role in concert with public health professionals who respond to positive tests or elevated blood lead levels with case investigation, with tracking and epidemiology, and with enforcement of preventive measures to prevent further or future lead exposure. Next slide, please. There are a number of opportunities in primary care to prevent exposure to environmental health hazards of various kinds. This graphic highlights some opportunities to provide counseling on primary prevention of lead exposure. So at well visits during infancy, we have an opportunity to ask questions about exposure in the home, whether it's chipping or peeling paint, providing advice about taking off shoes in the home, about lead safe remediation practices if there is peeling and chipping paint in the home, using a damp cloth to wipe down windowsills, baseboards, advice about running water cold before using it for drinking or mixing formula, And then there are also some opportunities at future well visits around arts and crafts exposures, occupational exposures for certain immigrant populations that may have other exposures. So we do have a role to play before testing. We do our first lead test at that 12-month well visit. We have really important opportunities to counsel families about preventing lead exposure in the first place. Next slide. So I mentioned that, that counseling on primary prevention related to lead exposure in housing, making sure that lead safe practices are used in renovation, repair, and painting. Counseling about nutritional sufficiency, especially iron and calcium and vitamin C rich diets. And Dr. Newman alluded to that a little bit in his remarks as well. Again, mentioning to families about using lead safe practices when doing work on older housing. Next slide, please. So here's where we're going to talk a little bit about what the reference level means and how we got to it and why it changed. We used to call the threshold for elevated blood lead levels a level of concern. We know increasingly, we understand that there is no safe level of lead in the blood, and so we now call this a reference value. And we can see here that this graphic illustrates how blood lead levels have declined over over time. And so what is considered an acceptable blood lead level has changed, and what we now call a reference level has changed. And the next slide, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Right, so there's no safe blood level of lead, so we now call this a reference value, the 5 micrograms per deciliter. It's determined based on NHANES data that every 2 years is analyzed, and the level of the reference level is the level at which 97.5% of children under the age of 6 have a level below this number. So that's what this graphic shows. It's based on standard deviations around a statistical average, and that is why the level has changed. Like, thankfully, that at a population level, the prevalence of elevated blood lead levels has kind of shifted downward, or what the average level is has shifted downward. So it was 10 not that long ago. It has dropped to 5. It may change again. There has been sort of an underemphasis in practice on primary prevention, and this idea that it's not possible to focus on primary prevention, and that is something that we as clinicians have an opportunity to shift in our counseling, and that from a policy perspective is really important that we shift as well. We already talked about the return on investment for lead abatement. Next slide, please. We already reviewed in the last segment symptoms of acute lead toxicity. I'm going to advance to the next slide. The most important, quote, treatment for lead exposure is to stop the exposure, to stop future exposure. And that's where the working in concert between clinicians and public health professionals is so important. Lead inspection and abatement is incredibly important. We also have a role in helping families to optimize iron and calcium intake. And then when needed, we have a role in providing medical therapy, chelation. We'll talk about all of that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So just the next section, I'm just gonna review the testing and follow-up guidelines briefly, and just sort of offer a snapshot of what the medical management guidelines look like. For children with a lead, let me have you go back to that slide. For children with a lead level below 5 micrograms per deciliter, we review the lab results with families, keeping in mind that the geometric mean of blood lead levels for children is less than 2 micrograms per deciliter across the country. So to use the opportunity of a child who has a blood level of 3 or 4, there's still an opportunity to provide some counseling around preventing further exposure and being thoughtful about sources of exposure in the home or wherever else the child is spending time, in child care center and relatives' homes. And then we repeat test children according to local guidelines and Ohio Department of Health guidelines. So if a child at 12 months has a lead level under 5, we provide some counseling. We repeat the test usually at the next well visit or in a year. So we talked about anticipatory guidance, optimizing nutrition, addressing iron deficiency risk factors. Next slide, please. This is really the same information, but a snapshot of what the ODH medical management guidelines look like in sort of table form. Next slide. So for children with blood lead levels of 5 to 9 micrograms per deciliter, we provide all that same anticipatory guidance. We need to confirm a venous sample if the sample was drawn via a finger stick. This level is reported to the health department. We are, again, taking an environmental history, providing counseling about future exposure, providing nutritional advice. And it's important to note that now the automatic eligibility criteria for early intervention in the state of Ohio have been amended to include blood lead levels of 5 micrograms per deciliter or greater. Next slide, please. So I actually want to talk about that a little bit because that's new within the past year. If you move to the next slide. What it means for this elevated blood lead level to be an automatic eligibility criterion is that even in the absence of current signs of developmental delay, children with a blood lead level of 5 or greater are eligible for early intervention services. The early intervention program has been doing a lot of work all over the state and trying to anticipate and respond to this influx of referrals for children with elevated blood lead levels. Like, what does it mean for children to be automatically eligible for services when a lot of times if the reason for referral is elevated blood lead level, they may not have current signs of developmental delay. And so sort of the traditional therapies that we think about with early intervention may not necessarily apply. So there's been some work on adding nutrition services to the early intervention team. We, I believe, are just starting that in Cuyahoga County. There are there's also a desire to look at the addition of social work services to work with service coordinators and the early intervention team. There's a pilot that's underway in Cuyahoga County to sort of test this out so that there's an element of sort of social needs navigation where the social work team as part of the early intervention program can help families with addressing housing issues, to coordinate resources to support those families, and then also to assist families in supporting children's healthy development, making sure that they're connected with high quality early childhood education and those kinds of things. Next slide, please. For children with blood lead levels of 5 or greater, referrals are automatically sent from the Ohio Department of Health to early intervention programs. The primary care physician can also refer. And of course, as always, parents can self-refer as well. And the early intervention program in Cuyahoga County offered this, this content to share with you to give me some examples of the kinds of outcomes the EI programs are looking at with this sort of new population of referrals. So outcomes can include ensuring a healthy home environment. It can include a healthy diet with the new nutrition program. And there's also an interest, as I mentioned, in supporting families and providing a supportive and nurturing environment to promote healthy development. Next slide, please. Again, this is from the Cuyahoga County Early Intervention Program, just to give us a sense for what the EI team looks like. Some of these are familiar, like the physical therapist, occupational therapist, and speech language pathologist, and the service coordinator. Some of these programs are familiar to us. The additions here are the social worker and the nutrition services program that are still sort of being rolled out, and in some cases the social work program is still being piloted. And the idea is that these would all work in concert. As we know, a lot of the families that are referred for elevated blood levels will benefit from having that integration of the social work team. And the other thing I'll say is that, of course, more opportunities for eligibility for early intervention is a good thing for those of us who care for children in primary care. We know that there's rarely only one risk factor for developmental issues that prompts us to refer to early intervention. So the addition of another eligibility criterion is helpful. Next slide, please. So looking at medical management guidelines for children with blood levels greater than 10, again, same, it should say perform steps for lead level less than 10. Again, confirming with the venous sample if this was a capillary test. And the additional information here that I want to make sure I point out is that the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, PACU.net, is a helpful resource. And in contacting the PACU program, Dr. Newman and his team can provide support and advice for those of us here in Ohio. And then the Ohio Department of Health has some helpful resources for lead abatement as well. In Cuyahoga County, a lead level of 10 or greater is what triggers the local health department to do a lead inspection in the child's home. Next slide, please. So again, just a snapshot, but this is what in table form the medical management guidelines look like, and it provides from the ODH, and it provides really detailed information about follow-up testing and sort of the time interval for future follow-up. I should mention too, I'm sorry, can you go back to the last slide really quickly? A couple of other things that you might notice on this table that wasn't in the text on the previous slide, considering an abdominal x-ray if retained lead chips are a possibility, and that bowel decontamination needs to be performed if we find that. And I think that's it. I think everything else was included. Next slide, please. For children with lead levels greater than 44 micrograms per deciliter, this is where we're getting into the range of considering hospitalization and chelation therapy, and the PACU program can be a really helpful partner and resource. Next slide, please. I think this is where I turn it back over to Dr. Newman, and we're going to talk about chelation.
Hello. All right. Hey, you're all hanging in here through this long presentation. So before I talk about chelating agents, I just wanted to get to a couple of things in the chat box that we're going by. And hopefully I haven't missed anything. There was a question about empowering patients to help, or parents to help catch abnormal results. I think probably the best way to do that, I mean, like, and I understand how difficult this is. I mean, like trying to report all those results back to parents and get them actually to do something. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, I think the parents and we get kind of bombarded with a huge amount of data like flowing by. I know that one of the ways that parents locally in Cincinnati have become empowered is that one of the FQHCs has a little bit of funding from the Catholic Church to do follow-up for kids whose blood levels are elevated, to make sure the parents know what's going on, that they remind them to get tested, et cetera. And that little bit of like reminder and engagement has actually been really, really successful in terms of driving down like the number of kids in that clinic whose blood levels turn out to be extremely high. The other thing I saw, statistics in rural areas, I'm guessing, one of the issues is we've run into is that sometimes the testing rates in the rural areas are pretty low. I've looked at some geographic-based data, but I couldn't. Basically, if you go look back at that map that we had, part of how you got on that map as being high risk was that a certain percentage of the kids had tested above 5, and the basically there's still a lot more lead in some of the rural areas than I think people fully appreciate, because so much emphasis is on the urban ones. I think that's, oh, and the point of care lead is higher than 5. So I believe the Ohio Department of Health requests that the confirmation be done within a month. I think that's their general guideline. And if the point of care reads above 5, I believe that's what it is. So I'm going to move on to chelating agents. And I really just want to stress back to that other slide, like the number one, not 2 fingers, one thing to do is to stop the exposure. And this spring, we've had a number of kids admitted to Cincinnati Children's because of a very high lead levels. And the main, the part of the reason they're admitted is that we know it's a lead-free environment here. And then the medical management with medical chelation. And basically, the chelating agents are designed to bind the metal ions. And you can see the list of them there, so that they become water soluble and they are excreted faster through the kidney. But unfortunately, a lot of these agents have toxicity to other parts of the body, such as the bone marrow, liver, or the kidney. And the number of approved uses is actually quite limited. Next slide, please. So the cautions, there's no benefit for chelation for blood lead levels less than 45. And this is a study that will never be repeated, but was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial with Suxmer. And the children were followed out to age 7. And there was a transient decrease in the blood lead levels in the treatment groups, but a year or two post-chelation, they weren't much different. And the reason for that is likely because lead follows calcium. And in children, 70% of the body burden of lead is in the bone. And the chelating agents are actually quite good at removing lead from the blood, but not as good as a group from moving them from the bone. And so what happens, and I see this all the time in my practice because I do a fair amount of chelation for lead and occasionally something else, where you get a drop, but then once you stop the medication, like water finds its own level, right? And so what happens is it re-equilibrates, and the lead in the bone just disperses back out into the blood again, and the blood level goes up. Now, the reason they did this study was that animal studies had suggested that non-lead exposed animals treated with Suxmer had worse neurodevelopmental outcomes than the animals that they treated with lead. So, for low levels of lead. So basically what they were, what they didn't want to have happen is that people just using these chelating agents indiscriminately. And so you're not going to find all the dosages and other things in this talk, because really it's recommended this be done in conjunction with an experienced practitioner, in part because of the toxicity and in part because of the importance of that chelation is really the last thing that you need to do. The first thing you need to do is to stop the child from being exposed. It would be like your bathtub is overflowing and what you say is, well, I'm going to start bailing it out with a teaspoon. But really what you need to do is turn off the water. And so, next slide, please. And like I was just trying to say before, there's this homeostasis between the blood and the bone and the other organs. Can you just click ahead one, I think, okay, and just click one more time? So the key take-home point here is that the half-life in the bone, it can be measured in decades, and the half-life in the blood is like a month. And so you bring it out, but the bone like holds on to this for a very, very long time. And we think that's part of what the whole toxicity of lead is over the lifespan. It's like it's slowly being released over time. back out of the bone. Next slide, please. So what's the public health response to lead? Well, education, trying to teach people what they need to do to prevent additional exposure and mitigate the current one. Investigate to see like where it's coming from, and then if necessary, some kind of enforcement. Next slide, please. So if the lead level is between 5 and 9, the health department in Ohio will respond. And so that might be a phone call, or it might be that they send a technician or a nurse out to the house. And for the most part now, because of the COVID restrictions, it's mostly a phone call. And they do a risk assessment questionnaire over the phone. Now, as an example, the Cincinnati Health Department for a couple of decades has had what they used to call a primary prevention program, but now it's just 5 to 9. But the public health nurse makes a visit. They do a structured nutritional, developmental, and environmental screening. They provide cleaning materials, education, and they obtain a water sample, which they send to the Greater Cincinnati Water Works. And I'll tell you, in the years that I've been doing this, we've had very, very few water samples that have been abnormal, but that's really a function of the health of our water treatment system, not, like that's indicating the system is working. Next slide, please. So if the lead level is 10 or above, a public health lead risk assessment is done, which basically means a lead risk assessor who's licensed walks through the home. This is a picture of an XRF scanner. So like on site, they can actually measure the amount of lead like in a molding or in a door frame or whatever. They'll also collect dust wipe samples because the dust wipe is what determines what needs to be done. And then there's also a nurse who's involved who does the case management and kind of helps the family through the process. Next slide, please. So if there are lead hazard present, it's the property owner's responsibility to fix that. And the process is known as abatement. And there's 90 days is what the law says from the time that the orders are written to the work needing to be carried out. Typically, it takes a little longer than that. If you're making progress, you can get deferments, et cetera. But after a year, if it's not been done, that's it. It gets on the vacate list. And the Ohio Department of Health has maintained a registry. Now, there are a number of resources for lead abatement. Children, lower income children are maybe eligible for the S-CHIP lead abatement grant through the state. There's also a middle income grant for people who are further above the poverty line, but not like very well off. And then all across the state, there are multiple HUD lead abatement grants. I think for this fiscal year, the state has $85 million of grants, which is extraordinary, more than any other state in the country. And so this is an opportunity to strike while the iron is hot, basically, to test children if they're high, get the issues fixed as quickly as possible. And for people who are higher income, there's a lead income tax credit that is also run through the Ohio Department of Health and the Ohio Department of Taxation. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk through a clinical scenario, and I think the question here is perhaps more rhetorical. I don't think we have a poll attached to this, correct? Since I completely messed up the poll the last time. So you can all read, but I'll just narrate. So Timmy's a 12-month-old here for just a routine well visit. And he lives with his mom, just regular history you would get, lives in an apartment with his mom and 2 siblings. You might, this is why these lead questionnaires aren't that helpful. She doesn't know the age of the building. She rents it, right? She has no idea. He visits with his dad, and he works in construction, and he lives in a building that mom describes as older with the paternal grandmother. Mom goes to school. The child goes to child care. He's insured by Medicaid. Does he need a blood lead level? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. According to Ohio law, he needs a lead level because he's insured by Medicaid. And just some basic questions. Someone doesn't know the age of the housing, assume it's old. And dad has an occupation that's suspect. So his lead level comes back 7.5. The health department calls the family, discusses like stuff that they should do, wipe things down, iron-rich foods, discourage oral behaviors, and they recommended getting a lead level in about 3 months because it was elevated. 15 months, Timmy's back, and mom's been cleaning, dad changes his clothes, and they check some other labs because we're following the protocol, right? So we got the lead, we got a CBC, and then we're assessing iron status. Either, depending on your lab, you can either get reticulocyte hemoglobin or ferritin and CRP, and we check it. It turns out the ferritin is low. The lead is even higher, 12, right? You're like, oh, shoot. And mom says that she's cleaning all the time, and the hemoglobin is low. So, okay, all right. So we've got some things we need to address, right? So next slide, please. So the health department performs a lead risk assessment. Turns out mom's home was actually quite old. It was about 100 years old. There were lead hazards in multiple areas, windows and trim. Those are the most likely spots because lead paint resists water, and so it was used in wet and areas that had a lot of traffic. And so, and there was some water damage to one of the walls, so there was a little bubbling of the old paint. There's some bare soil in the backyard. Yeah, he is like the classic case, right? He has like everything. He drinks a huge amount of milk. So his dad's home is not that old, and it was renovated. So dad's home probably is not, and his work turned out not to be a problem. So I see something that came in. It said the venous level is greater than 5. Does the health department automatically get in touch with the family, or do we have to do a referral? So basically, the state law requires all these lead levels go to the Ohio Department of Health, but it does sometimes take some time for that system to complete its cycle. So if you have the staff that are able to alert the local health department, that would be wonderful because it helps them get the ball rolling faster. But it should be reported in within a week is when it should go in. And if you use any of the commercial labs, they have relationships with the Ohio Department of Health. So next slide, please. So iron supplementation, right? So the ferritin is 5, that's quite low. That dramatically increases lead absorption because one of the transporters, the dimetyl transporter 1 in the small bowel, it transports both iron and lead. And when the iron is low, that regulator is, that transporter is upregulated. And, until it can be fixed, you can reinforce like temporary measures like taping over areas that are chipping. Like don't mess with them, but you can cover them up. If the soil in the backyard's contaminated, try not to play back there. Go in the front yard, go to the park. It would not be a bad idea to recheck the lead level fairly soon afterwards because it's already gone up like a couple of notches, and so we don't want to be in a really bad spot. Next slide, please. So the second clinical scenario is a little bit more complicated and probably illustrates maybe also a place where the PACU can help you out a little bit. So this case is of a 1 and 2-year-old male and then his sister who were just in for a routine visit. They live in Cincinnati with their mom and dad. They have Medicaid. So yes, do they need a lead level? Yes, because they're 1 and 2 years old and they live in a high-risk area. Basically all of Cincinnati and all of Hamilton County where we are is considered high risk, and they have Medicaid. So it's like they've checked all the boxes. Next slide, please. So the 1-year-old's level was 18 and the 2-year-old level was 14. Next slide. So the health department went out and they said, well, yeah, it's older housing, but there was no lead-based paint in the home. It was built in, I think, 1960, as I recall. And so like it was after the phase out had started, but there was lead dust detected at the front door. So that, you know, makes you think, if it's not in the building, it's got to be coming from outside the building. Next slide. So what other things would you want to ask? Someone's saying they can't hear. Have I stopped? Can other people hear me?
Nick, it's Chris. I can hear you fine.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks. Just want to, every once in a while, something weird happens. You don't want to be. So what other things might be useful to know? Like, what do the parents do for a living? Is there anything going on nearby? Like, did they just demolish, you know, a house nearby that there could have been some dust that came over? We know the kids who live within a couple 100 feet of a building that's demolished, they will they'll see increases in the lead levels. And there are other items in the home that might be suspicious, you know, like spices, etc. Next slide, please. So, so that, you know, the basic order of operations, some clinician sees them, the health department gets involved, and in this case, NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, got involved in this case because there was a suspicion from the work site. Next slide. So Dad actually worked at an e-waste recycler, and that's how the occupational folks got involved. Next slide. And he worked at this CRT grinder. So basically, you know, the old television sets, so he just like threw them in and it would grind them up to recycle them. And he said, yeah, all this dust would come out. Next slide. And the same clothes he wore home, like, and it worked. So like there was a way this stuff could go back and forth. Next. And his wife said he just comes home covered with dust. Next. And the kids would meet him at the door. Next. Play with them. This goes better when I'm doing the slide myself. But anyway, so basically this is a picture of the machine where the work was being done. And basically the picture tubes were crushed in that machine. And when they examined it, they found that dust wipe, very high levels of lead all over there. The facility had no showers and there were no like engineering controls. Like there was nothing up to prevent that kind of back, you know, splash or whatever of all the dust. And this was actually right near where the break room was, where people were eating. And so even after people had washed up, they still had detectable lead on their hands, and almost all the uniforms tested positive for lead. So you could definitely see how this could be moved to the home. Next slide. And so I just wanted to point out just like the amount of lead that's in like these old picture tubes. And this is why like a lot of places, they won't let you throw them out, or no one even, you know, you have to pay them to get rid of them, right? But like a, you know, 25-inch picture tube might have like 3 pounds of lead in the non, and then even if it's labeled as a no lead panel CRT, so you could see how this could happen. And we're measuring micrograms, right? So like you've got pounds versus micrograms. You're talking like how many orders, what, 7 or 8 orders of magnitude difference? I mean, so it's not surprising that enough lead came home to raise the kids' blood levels. I just saw a question about regulations require periodic testing of adults. So that's a really good question, because like in most facilities, you know, that they know that there's lead, there's actually a lead surveillance program. And in the case of this particular case, the people who were running this whole operation were not actually totally aware of the lead content of the materials that they were working with. And so there wasn't actually a surveillance program in place. So that was a significant deficiency. And there was a whole, well, OSHA is the enforcement arm. There was a lot of enforcement that went on with this case. Next slide. So as it turned out, the parental blood level was also markedly elevated. And everybody's blood level went down after the dad changed jobs. He felt like it wasn't really like in their interest for him to stay there, and he was able to get something better. Next slide. And then this was a case that we had worked up, but I guess like I put it here as an illustration that, you know, sometimes the source is something that it takes a bit of detective work to get to the bottom of, and that's part of what my job in the state is to help have happen, so that I can kind of bridge between the physicians who are pediatricians who are testing the lead and following up with these kids, and then I can help manage some of this as well. So next slide. So things to talk about, like before you're testing, you know, talk about like, you know, basically lead poisoning is common but preventable, and it increases your risk for learning or behavior problems. We don't think any amount is safe, and it's required by law to have, you know, the kids need to be tested if they meet the requirements by ODH, which is Medicaid or living in a high-risk zip code. The truth is, it's like only like half the kids in the state are being tested who are high risk. And in the past, this wasn't the case, but we actually do have state and local financial resources to help families deal with this, but both like with the housing issues and with the developmental and behavioral issues. And children with iron deficiency absorb lead a lot more easily than children with normal iron. And then basically, you know, to understand that the lead level in kids overall is somewhere between 1 and 2 right now. And so if you have a lead level of 5 or 6, like that's way higher. Like if you had someone with a cholesterol of 1,000, you would react, right? You know what I mean? And so, you know, and I'm not saying like you have to like go crazy, but like it's something that we shouldn't just blow off. The local health department and the, you know, and so the health department and the physicians, we have a role to play. And although all these effects can't be reversed, we know that we can reduce the risk. I think of this as like hypertension is a risk factor for having a heart attack. But, you know, if you have hypertension, we're going to do other things to try to reduce your risk for a heart attack too. Like, okay, let's get you to stop smoking. Let's improve your diet. Let's get more exercise. So we're going to try to modify as many of the risk factors as we can. And there's also a benefit to not having your lead high for a long time, like to minimize how long it's high. Next slide, please. And this we put together, this is on the Ohio AAP website, but we put together a little flow chart, like how to think about this, you know, Medicaid insured, yes, obtain a lead level, you know, what to do if it's high, if it's 5 or above, like how was it drawn, if it's under 5, like, you know, when should we recheck it? And we took this from the QI project that we put together. So, I know I keep saying this over and over, but the reason for that is that ODH is really concerned that we're missing like half the kids. And testing is down by 70% during COVID, so we're missing even more of the kids. So lead testing is required for high-risk kids if they're i.e. Medicaid or high-risk zip code at 1 and 2 years of age. Primary prevention is what we want to do, and anticipatory guidance. And I can't stress the importance of just bringing parents awareness to this, because they start to think about it, and they you know, it's been shown that they'll actually try to do something. And like I said, in kids who are exposed, the first step is to stop the exposure, address the risk factors, and chelation only like in experienced hands, because like we've had some issues with chelation with some people. So next slide, please. So there are some questions that have come up in the chat. Let me just see. According to the Detroit study, average lead level of students with IEP is 9.6. Yeah, that's not that's unfortunately not surprising. I mean, there's a strong relationship between lead and IQ that is you know, that goes across like countries all around the world, and we're not immune to it. So I mean, I think we just need to be working to just put this on the radar, basically. Yeah, so some patient with private insurance do not want the lead test due to cost, even if they live in the high-risk zip codes. So what I've found, because we've gotten some calls about that, you know, often it may be an issue with, because I've talked to like the medical director at Blue Cross Blue Shield, like Anthem, and they said, yeah, that's a covered service, but like it depends on how the thing is written. You know what I mean? So like, what did the company actually, like, what's the copay? What's the, you know, what do they have to go to a specific lab? For some of those families, it might be a lot cheaper to do the screening in the office if it's possible. Unfortunately, there really aren't any resources through like public health anymore to get lead levels checked. Some of the families I've talked to have kind of shopped around a little bit, and they'll ask, you know, oh, okay, can we go to Quest instead of somewhere else? Let's see, can you explain that ODH can't even begin a public health lead investigation without the testing, which makes lead testing even more important? Yeah, so it's kind of a weird system. I mean, like, so ideally, perhaps we would try to test the housing before the kids are in it. And I know that is what's starting to happen in Toledo. There's a number of other cities across the country where that's happened: Rochester, New York, Boston. That has been quite effective at reducing the lead exposure. And unfortunately, like, ODH doesn't get into the home until the lead level is higher. Now, the SCHIP grant does have a stipulation that if you have a child in a home that's built before 1978, that they really had wanted to put more of their money towards primary prevention. So that's a program within the SCHIP program, but they've had to kind of limit it because they were burning through all the money just trying to deal with all the lead poison kids. When is ODH going to resume lead inspections of homes that have been identified with elevated lead levels in children? So right now, as far as I'm aware, ODH has only been going to the houses of the kids that I've admitted to the hospital or have otherwise been put on chelation. That's all that I'm aware of. I do not know when they're restarting their regular lead risk assessments. I do know that some of the local health departments have started to do that. Certainly the Cincinnati Health Department never stopped. They put in some safety protocols pretty early, as well as our county health department. And then the lead resources are available. Oh, yeah, so there's a response from the Ohio Department of Health. We don't have a date as to when they're going to begin inspections in the kid. Yeah, so that there are doing the cases where the kids are requiring chelation.
Great, thank you, Dr. Newman.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I kind of blabbered on there, but you're giving me the hook here. So, right.
No,
Well, thank you so much. Take care.
Great, and we will take note of the questions, any questions that we missed, and make sure that those get answered. And then my name is Alex Miller. I am the program manager for the lead project, and I just wanted to quickly give an overview of some of the resources that our team has created with the help of ODH to kind of give more information about lead prevention. We have an interactive website where you can type in the zip code or the county and see if it is high risk or not. We also have resources for providers, families, education and training material, more information about our QI program, as well as a link to the ODH website and the CDC. We have a family rat card that can be used with families in the pediatrician's office, as well as social workers, home visitors. They can use this card with families, quick tips on lead facts, and ways for families to navigate high lead test levels. We also have a resource guide for providers when they're testing and working with children with high blood lead levels and knowing when to test. A lot of our information came from the Planet material, again, that ODH had already created, and we added some additional material that Dr. Newman and Dr. Bull had added to that. If there are any questions at any time, you can send me an email and I can provide more information, links